Okay, guys, we're back. Sorry, I had to take a break, so I kind of lost my train of thought for a little bit. But if I remember correctly, where we just were, this is part two of the lecture for the first day of Holy Week for the sophomore class. We talked about how the story was coming full circle, right? How everything, it's kind of been anticipatory so far. There have been a lot of things, in the last chapter. There's a lot of different words hinting along the lines of things being buried, things needing to be uncovered. This theme of visibility and lack of visibility, we've already seen it quite a bit through the text. For example, when Hyde murdered Sir Danvers Carew, it was plainly visible who it was. He did it in broad moonlight, so to speak. Unlike the very next day, when there was a lot of fog and there was a lot of mist and it was difficult to see. That's part of both the horror and the mystery genre kind of coming forth. One of the things that we can also see in terms of this text and what it's doing is in returning to the Sunday stroll and talking about the idea of them traversing, right, going across different areas, right, and this idea of a thoroughfare, is that once again we see that the author is cleverly kind of putting in these ideas of visibility versus not great visibility. On a thoroughfare, the idea is the street is going to be wider and there's going to be a lot more people and a lot more visibility. When they go and they happen to see the door again, the door upon which there's the window right above it, we see that once again, right, they're going by these things, called the by streets, right? And these by streets, kind of the side streets, they're a lot more narrow and there's a lot less visibility, right? It's a place where someone is a little bit more likely to get mugged. More than that, in this idea of, the different neighborhoods, the kind of different areas coming up against each other, is this idea of now they're entering away from kind of the main thoroughfare. They're going away from, shall we say, the main, more open, more visible part of civilization, and they're heading into something that it's not quite an alley, but you could call it like an alley, right? That's kind of one of the ideas that we're talking about on this Sunday walk. So they're going from a place that's more open to a place that is now less visible, right? This is the idea of them kind of entering into this place, this domain of Henry Jekyll, which is not completely out in the open, right? That Jekyll has kind of removed himself from the main road of civilization, so to speak, and he's now in a place where he is, the idea of is the idea of they're now kind of entering into the mysterious place, right? They're going in and out. It's a compare and contrast again, right? This idea of the alleyway, right? A place where there are walls and a place where, there's not as much visibility. It's a little bit more narrow. It once again stays on the theme of the comparison between a narrow space versus a wide open space and the comparison between visibility and non-visibility, right? This is where Jekyll is. And so by going onto the by streets and returning to this place of the door, it's like they're kind of returning, they're going from everyday life and they're kind of going into this kind of, not dark, but narrow alley of the mystery. They're re-entering this area. It's kind of determining both a geographic and a, shall we say, mood divide that's going on in their lives. One of the things that we should understand about the house and the laboratory, right, is that we know, right, we talked about how you couldn't see in on the bottom floor. And so you have the door, right, you have the giant door. But then above the door, right, we have this window in which Henry Jekyll is seated, right? Now, I understand that, my stick figure drawing, and it's absolutely terrible. But one of the things that we should remember about kind of the insightful, but not necessarily very subtle images that are being associated with Jekyll and Hyde and what symbolically Robert Louis Stevenson is trying to express. So we know, right, that when we see Hyde, right, we see him on the level of the door, right? And when we see Jekyll, we see him on the level of the window. When we see Hyde at this location, we see him at night. And when we see Jekyll, we see him in the middle of the day, right? So this is the contrast that we see. One of the things that we should also remember is that Freud is not big yet. I mean, you got to remember, Robert Louis Stevenson published this book before Freud was even a household name, although Freud becoming a household name was not too far away in the culture. And one of the things that Robert Louis Stevenson writes, he actually writes about dreams and their meaning and their symbolic meaning. That's one of the things I'm going to make you read once we get done with the text. But because of that, there was not any of this common Freudian parlance of these idea of the conscious versus unconscious mind, right? That was not a part of the lexicon yet, right? That was not part of the verbiage, right? The common use of the language, right? And so because that wasn't part of the common use, we still see some ideas, though, symbolically that seem to resemble what we would later call Freudian thought. It's why the psychoanalysts who study literature, the people who like to study from that psychoanalytic perspective, really like a lot of this symbolism, which seems to come straight out of Freud, even though it's actually before Freud in terms of the time period. Because when you have Jekyll at the window up here, right, and then you have Hyde down here at the door, right, what this can be thought of to indicate is if we were to think of the house and the laboratory as images of Jekyll and Hyde, prospectively, like the duality of the self, the front where he lives and where he allows the servants to see him would be like the Jekyll part. And then, of course, the laboratory, right, with all the secrets and the darkness and the isolation, that would be like the Hyde part, right, the public face versus the interior self. We also see that there's this image here about this idea of the higher versus the lower self, right? The higher self and the lower self, right? And the images of higher self and lower self, this was already common in what people were talking about even before Freud was talking about the conscious and the unconscious mind. So this image, right, that we see Jekyll at a window in the same place where we see Hyde at the door, right? A back door, of course, sinister, right? One of the things, though, that we see is there is kind of an illusion of the union between two things, that Jekyll and Hyde actually, that they might go together more than we would have thought immediately, because this is the first time we really see Jekyll on the street from this view. We did see him with Utterson, right, in the laboratory earlier, but the idea is that now we're kind of seeing him from the same perspective, right, that we're seeing him from Enfield and Utterson's perspective from the street. And so the idea is there's a kind of a connection between the two that's being subtly hinted at, but also the idea of the divide between the higher and the lower, right, symbolically, which doesn't seem to be particularly difficult to figure out, just because, upper versus lower, mind versus body, the images are not particularly difficult to figure out. The person who really loves using this kind of imagery about levels of the self and layers of the self, most famously, is actually the movie director Alfred Hitchcock. And interestingly enough, Alfred Hitchcock, he was inspired when he made the film Psycho. He was partly inspired by Freud and Freud's levels of the conscious, but he was also influenced by this text, Jekyll and Hyde, in which he saw how parts of a house could be reflective of parts of a human person. In Hitchcock's Psycho, and I know I'm going to be spoiling it for some of you, the killer is this person by the name of Norman Bates, who actually suffers from a split personality disorder. You think that the murderer is Norman Bates' mother for much of the film, until you realize you see Norman Bates in a dress and wearing his mother's wig, and you realize he has some kind of multiple personality schizophrenia. Anyway, I'm sorry for ruining that for you. Anyway, the point is that there are three layers of the Bates Motel. There's the basement, there's the main floor, of course, and then there's the upstairs, right? Now, the upstairs is supposedly where Norman's mother lives, and that's emblematic of the idea of the superego, right? And then you have the main floor, which is the ego. This is where you always encounter Norman. And then the basement is the dwelling place of the id, right? One of the interesting things that Hitchcock does extremely effectively in this film is that he with the traveling from the different levels of the house, we see the tortured bits of Norman's mind, the competing levels between his ego, his main self, his repressed impulses in the basement, and the superego, right? The voice of his mother in his head, the force that's kind of repressing him, the thing that's holding him down. One of the things that Hitchcock writes about is that Robert Louis Stevenson was extremely influential in using parts of a building to represent parts of the mind or parts of the self. He talks about how he really likes that idea and really thought that even though it was before Freud, he could use this idea of different parts of the building to represent different parts of the self. But one of the key ideas in Psycho that a lot of people miss is that there's actually a link in it between the highest level, right? That's the attic, right? Or the upstairs, right? Which is where the superego dwells. And also the basement, right? Which is where the id dwells. Now you would think that the superego, right? In Freud, the superego is what holds the id back. It's kind of the social pressure. The superego is like the self that other people expect you to be, right? The greater ego. But the idea that Hitchcock uses, and this is straight out of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is that the link between the id and the superego cannot be ignored. In the sense that it is the superego, that thing that represses behavior, that confines behavior, right, that actually creates the id, that there's an inescapable link between the superego and the id, because you have the force that's being repressed, and then you have the repressing force. And in Psycho, all of the murders tend to happen, right, in one of these two areas. They either happen in the basement or on the upstairs floor. In fact, there's a very famous murder that happens at the top of the stairs, and then the person falls down the stairs. In the same way, right, what we see in this idea of the two levels, right, and how these two levels are being portrayed in this chapter, is the general idea that the thing that makes Hyde so vicious is the idea that he is being repressed, right? And now that he has divided his self, right, that is the kind of idea that there is some kind of interplay going on. There's some kind of union between the superego and the id, right? That's not the language that Robert Louis Stevenson would have used. But what we have to understand is that there is a sense in which we see how the way that Jekyll's mood is, that he's frightened of his lower impulses that he cannot control, that he's kind of sitting outside looking forlorn, hoping to control it, but really unable to maintain and unable to withhold it. But the idea, right, is that there is a union between those two things, the upper and the higher self, that cannot truly be divided, and the effort to divide them is what is causing Jekyll, and it's what's causing his lack of health and his deterioration. So we're going to discuss a little bit more some of the terms and the mood of Henry Jekyll and how that we need to understand that in this next section.